Hello, AP Comparative students. This is Andrew Canine from Studio Room 2C, where there's always room to see how countries compare. Welcome back to our third day of review for the AP Comparative Government and Politics course. Happy to have you with us. Happy to see those messages that you're sending to your teachers on social media. They deserve a huge thank you. I know there's a lot of activity going on by comparative government teachers trying to get you in to watch these reviews, either live or at any time of your choosing. So thank you for their hard work. I know they are anxious to see you prepared for this exam, as am I. So let's get to it. Again, hopefully you have seen my materials that I'm trying to share with you via College Board description. If you have not seen this course description, head on over to this web address to the course index page. You can also get a PDF. And let me remind you that you can also go online, not only to College Board. Let's see if I can pull this up. Here we go. So you can go to the College Board, the course index page, just find Comparative Government and Politics, go to the course, go to the very bottom of the page and download the course description. And that's where you can find that document. You can also go to citizenu.org, which is the website that Mr. Larson's created, my colleague at Stevenson High School. He's kind enough to create the comparative corner, where if you click in there, you can download actually a document that includes the course description, but also includes all those, a lot of those supplemental notes that I've been including in these PowerPoint presentations. So feel free to use those resources. Going back here to the PowerPoint, I want to get into some of the very nice messages that you left for your teachers and the shout outs, including shout outs for Mr. Patty, Mr. Stang, Mr. Haregrove at Adrie Kell High School, Mrs. Harding at Leonardtown High School, and let's not forget Mr. Formaker at Franklin High School. And get on, if you have any questions, use Twitter at the hashtag AP CompGov 2020. Feel free to leave your shout outs there. Feel free to leave core country examples. Emmanuel actually did both. Based on our discussion yesterday about privatization, we included a small discussion about Pemex, the Mexico's state-owned oil company. And Emmanuel was able to combine Pemex as a core country example of privatization, along with a meme, incredibly, a meme that included both President Peña Nieto, the previous president of Mexico, and Pemex, and SpongeBob. Emmanuel's meme game is strong, I got to tell you. And in putting this all together, I think Emmanuel has created the first meme about Pemex. We're going to call that the Memex. Emmanuel, Shakespeare wrote Richard III during the Great Plague. Emmanuel created the first Memex displayed here at AP CompGov 2020. Thank you for that. Look forward to seeing more of your memes, because nothing is better than a meme that you describe without copyright permission on a live YouTube. Yesterday I left you with a sample exam practice question. We've been spending 3 days going over this one FRQ. This is what's called the quantitative analysis FRQ, which are worth 5 points. So if you get this type of data set FRQ, the rubric's going to be 5 points. And I left this as a sample for you to ask you if you could figure out how to explain what the data illustrate about the relationship between neoliberalism and state sovereignty. And this was our data table about per capita GDP of 4 of our AP comparative countries since joining the WTO, the World Trade Organization. And like with many of these FRQs, I'm trying to write a kind of a sample where you can see, you can maybe hopefully do your writing and compare what you're writing to these sample answers that I'm providing, but I'm also trying to give you tips that I give to AP Comparative Government teachers and to my students on how to maximize your score, regardless of what this question might be about. So for letter E, you got to answer the prompt, explain what the data illustrates. So make sure you include the data, make sure you include an explanation, and make sure you include any of the core concepts that are included in this particular prompt. So I try to do that with the sample answer. So again, I'm not being terribly creative. I'm being super clear by repeating the vocabulary of the prompt that the data of the table illustrates that neoliberalism can reduce state sovereignty. For example, and then I quote the data, make sure you put the data in there. Don't be shy about being specific about the data. It's there, use it. So we see the data from Nigeria when it joined the WTO in 1995. I use data from 2018 from the table. And then I talk about what that means, as the WTO required Nigeria and other member countries to adopt neoliberal policies such as reduced tariffs and imports. That's what the World Trade Organization is about. They're about world trade. They require member countries to reduce tariffs on imports. And then I get to my explanation. As Nigeria embraced this type of neoliberal policy, you'll want to make sure you include words from the prompt on trade. It meant, so I underlined that for you to show that this is that word of causation that you're going to need to include in any question that asks you to explain how, explain why. So this type of neoliberal policy on trade meant that some of Nigeria's governmental sovereignty, I've used another word from the prompt, over its trade policies was reduced. So this is talking about the relationship between neoliberalism and state sovereignty. This answers the fifth point of that particular FRQ. It also is a preview for what we're talking about today, and that is sovereignty as it relates to economic globalization. One of the words I've mentioned before in a previous topic from this unit is this word foreign direct investment, or FDI, foreign direct investment. We're going to get into the definition of that, but essentially it's very clear what it means. It's money from foreign investors coming into a country to essentially invest in private businesses. And this is part of that neoliberalism, that countries that embrace neoliberalism, even to a wide extent, like the United Kingdom, or to a lesser extent, like China with their special economic zones, you're allowing FDI in those private investors from outside your country. So consider here what, again, the positives and negatives, the costs and the benefits of FDI, foreign direct investment, and just come up with a real quick list of what would come off the top of your head if you had to give examples of neoliberalism, and if it was a question asking about positive or negatives, or what are the detriments or what are the benefits of foreign direct investment. Here's my short list. So one of the costs is a loss of sovereignty. I've actually been reading some news stories today about countries that, as they were prepping for COVID-19 and trying to establish a supply of medical supplies, you had some privately owned companies from foreign direct investors who were shipping those medical supplies out of that country. And so that causes a loss of sovereignty. Instead of the government having control over materials in its country, when you have foreign direct investment, a country loses some sovereignty. You'll see that play out in the question I've written about environmental pollution, or what we call environmental degradation. One of the benefits of foreign direct investment is you have less reliance on loans, particularly for developing countries, loans from the International Monetary Fund. This very much goes in with, if you're considering how to pay for college, would you rather take out a loan that you have to pay back over the course of years and pay interest to the banks that lend you that money? Or would you rather have some private investor invest money and give you money contingent that you might work for that company, that you would lose some sovereignty, but you would be committed? That's very similar to how foreign direct investment works with companies or countries. A government might lose some sovereignty, but they'd be less reliant on repaying those loans. Some of the costs of foreign direct investment, you now have private investors who can make employment decisions for a particular industry or a particular company. That might even include lowering wages, but it also means that a country is spending less on subsidizing those interests, on those industries. which could reduce government debt if a country embraced more foreign direct investment. And again, repeating that loss of sovereignty over the economy, but one of the benefits is you tend to see larger scale economic growth with foreign direct investment. So today we are talking about challenges from globalization. It's topic 5.3 in the College Board's course description. We're looking at what are the positive and negative consequences of economic globalization. We're again putting on our comparative lenses. We're going to be trying to compare economic globalization in different countries to be able to explain the impacts of economic globalization. And hopefully we'll do some practice questions where you're describing the positive and negative consequences of globalization. This actually ties back into Unit 1. I know there's questions out there about why are we studying Unit 5 when we're told that the test is only about content from Units 1, 2, and 3. Well, one of the critical words that is in Unit 1 is sovereignty. And that's a word I'm going to go over today. If you don't know what sovereignty is, I'm going to articulate what sovereignty is today, but also give you examples of how sovereignty is impacted with policies of neoliberalism and economic globalization. So that's where we're heading today. You've seen this. I will be starting Unit 1, Unit 1.1 on the next lesson. And we'll be going through sequence, Units 1, 2, and 3, with, again, a little bit of review from content of Unit 4 that applies to the first 3 units, and another day of review from Unit 5, just to remind you, before we leave each other on May the 1st, and tons of questions. And if you have questions, please put them out there on Twitter at #APCompGov2020. Here's what you need to know about economic globalization today and the challenges. Like I mentioned before, you should know that word sovereignty. And I've taken this definition, anytime I have an asterisk, it means I've taken the definition almost word for word, and if there's an asterisk there, it is word for word from the course description for AP Comparative Government. So that is the golden standard of definition. So sovereignty is the independent legal authority over a population in a particular territory. You're going to see here later, I'm actually going to mess up a definition the way that I typically see students when they're trying to define a word that has a lot of kind of nitty-gritty pieces to it. And I would say sovereignty is that. We know what sovereignty is. It's harder to actually put all those words together in a definition when you're really stressed about writing the exam in a short time frame. I'm going to show you a tip here later in free response writing about how you can handle that. So you should also know about foreign direct investment, which I've mentioned before. This particularly comes from multinational corporations that can pose a challenge to a government's foundational economic and ideas and principles. That is straight word for word from the College Board's course description of foreign direct investment. And then you should know the term environmental degradation, otherwise known as pollution, environmental problems created by industrializations and other forms of economic development. So into the course description, things you should know, and then some illustrative examples that I've included are different aspects of globalization that challenge sovereignty. And one of those is foreign direct investment. And one of the reasons that challenges sovereignty is that you have outside investors from MNCs, multinational corporations. Their priority is on making a profit. And sometimes that company, in their decision to make a profit, can go against the interest of a particular country where they're doing business. And that could be laying off workers in a time of economic challenge. That could be skirting pollution laws when it comes to environmental pollution of the air or water. And so that's where it challenges a government's sovereignty. You can also see multinational corporations spread cultural influences, often Western cultural influences, along with that trade. And then an example of this is from Mexico. I mentioned yesterday Pemex and the idea that President Obrador won the 2018 presidential party, partly due to his campaign pledges to reduce or to block the privatization reforms from the previous president, Peña Nieto, of Pemex. So in that regards, you see what's sometimes described as economic nationalism. And we've seen this in many countries around the world, including the United States, this kind of resentment of foreign influence in the economy, foreign influence in a domestic economy, in this idea of kind of prioritizing a particular country's control over the economy. So neither Mexico, nor Russia, nor the United States, or China is isolated in that phenomenon. In terms of environmental degradation, you should know that term environmental degradation because it can be a cost of neoliberal reforms. It often is a cost of neoliberal reforms. No country is immune from this. And no country is immune from the idea that citizens are going to be really upset with their government or their local government if that government is allowing any corporation or any industry to pollute. And particularly when that corporation might be controlled by foreign investors, there's particular resentment if that results in air pollution or water pollution. So one of the really interesting examples, maybe your teacher, if they cover this on a country by country process, they've covered China maybe already. They've talked to you about the Under the Dome documentary. This was kind of a version of a TED Talk in China about 5 years ago that had phenomenal number of views in a very short time by a broadcast journalist who was documenting air and water pollution in China. And it got so many views, in fact, the Chinese government, if you've heard of the Great Firewall, ended up blocking and taking down this video documentary so they could no longer be viewed in China. You can still access this. And if you've ever seen this, it's a fascinating documentary that comes from China. Iran, terrible pollution. Some of the most polluted cities in the world when it comes to air pollution. Also, there have been major problems in Iran with shortages of water. And so in all these countries, you do see, even in authoritarian governments, you see citizens, local citizens, environmental activists step up and challenge a government's authority, asking the government to do more to clean up the water, to clean up the air. And of course, we know, like in China, like in Iran, those activists that are challenging the government are much more likely to be oppressed and suppressed by authoritarian governments. And that certainly is what's happened in Iran as well. Mexico has more democratization, particularly when it comes to protests. So you see interest groups, environmental groups, that are more likely to protest and be allowed to protest because Mexico's government tends to protect those civil liberties of protesters, especially that word pluralism, where you have a lot of different groups that have concerns about environmental pollution. So that's where you see the difference between a democracy and authoritarian government. But let's not forget, in Mexico, big challenges with organized crime, the role of multinational corporations, where sometimes those corporations or drug cartels in the world of organized crime can suppress and oppress protesters if their authority is being challenged. Some other case-specific country or case-specific examples of environmental degradation include Nigeria, particularly with oil production in the Niger River Delta in southern Nigeria. And if you've studied Nigeria, or even if you haven't, you should maybe be familiar with the groups called MOSOP or MEND. MOSOP was the movement involving the Origami people, and MEND is the movement for the emancipation of the Niger River Delta. In both cases, those groups in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s were super involved and got a lot of attention because of the protests, in some cases, violent political protests directed towards the pollution of communities along the Niger River Delta. And so that's where you would see that activism, and again, in some cases, violent political activism because of concerns of environmental degradation relating to particularly multinational corporations in their role of exploring and extracting oil from the Niger River Delta. Russia is not immune from concerns about environmental degradation. There's a very famous example, case study from Russia, where the Russian government was allowing the construction of a really large highway between Moscow and St. Petersburg. The highway construction was essentially going to be done by a multinational corporation through a very famous national forest in Russia. And you actually saw in that instance protesters, even though, again, we know that Russia tends to be more towards the authoritarian side when it comes to treatment of protesters. But in that case, those environmental protesters were successful in getting Russia's government to address their concerns, because those protesters used the spirit of nationalism, of how could we let this foreign multinational corporation tear down a large segment of this Kamiki national forest in Russia. And the government actually addressed those concerns of the protesters. In the United Kingdom, because the United Kingdom tends to be more thoroughly democratic, you see a lot more pluralism when it comes to environmental groups with a lot of different concerns about environmental pollution in the United Kingdom. But the United Kingdom tends to be much more tolerant in protecting the civil liberties of those groups. Here's where we also have in Unit 5.3 a little bit of international relations. And in those international relations, you have to know in terms of how the sovereignty of a country could be challenged by international organizations such as the United Nations or international sanctions. And so here's where two of our countries that are really fascinating with this are Russia and Iran. And more recent examples of international sanctions with Russia involve Russia's takeover and annexation of Crimea from Ukraine starting in 2014. And then with Iran, this back and forth between the United States and Iran involving international economic sanctions related to Iran's enrichment of uranium. And so when the Donald Trump administration came into power in the United States, by 2018, when the Trump administration decided to use economic sanctions to pressure Iran's government to reduce its support of militant groups in the development of ballistic missiles, you saw international sanctions through the United States reinforced, where even multinational corporations based in China, in Russia, and some of our other core countries had to follow along and abide by those international economic sanctions against Iran. So we also see that governments also work to obviously change their domestic economic policies to try to improve economic conditions. And just this week, some really interesting news out of Mexico, where last weekend, Mexico's President López Obrador was adamant that Mexico, and publicly stating that Mexico didn't have to worry about COVID-19. In fact, was quoted in local news there, encouraging Mexico's families, if they could, to go out and eat and support local economy. And then 2 days later, Mexico's national government announced a suspension of large gatherings of 100 or more. So you see through the current events, as we look at how different governments react to COVID-19, not only in terms of preventing the spread and responding to healthcare crises, you also have economic concerns. We've been reading a lot about this as it relates to the United States government when it comes to the legislative packages that Congress has passed. But in a moment, I'm going to ask you if you can think of some, or if you research some economic responses from our core countries to COVID-19, those might be interesting for you to post on Twitter. So let me show you some practice questions. I got some data here. To practice some of the data questions, multiple choice. And that is, if you see a data set here, describe the data presented. Again, you're not going to see multiple choice questions on the test that's coming up, but you could very easily see possibly data on an FRQ. And so it's never a bad thing to practice your data skills. So I'm going to give you a look at this pie chart, and it's the distribution of FDI, or foreign direct investment, into Mexico in 2019 by the country of origin. And I'm going to ask you, take a mental picture of that, and I'm going to ask you a couple questions based on that data. So the first question is, which of the following is an accurate pairing of what this data indicates? And is it the amount of the investment money received and which government spent the investment money? Is it the countries to which the investment money was given and the amount of investment money received? Which governments spent the investment money and the share of investment money? Or countries from where investment money came and the share of the investment money? So again, some critical skills when it comes to analyzing data is read the title. If there's an X and Y axis, read the labels and then read the question. So this was a question about foreign direct investment, and that pie chart was, in fact, about the countries from where the investment money came into Mexico and the share of investment money from those originating countries. So another question about that same pie chart. The data most likely indicates an effect from which of the following policies? So here's where you're going to use maybe not the specific numbers of the data, but the idea of foreign direct investment that was listed in the title into Mexico. And if you remember that the United States, a large share of the foreign direct investment coming into Mexico comes from the United States, and use your inference skills to know that that indicates an effect from NAFTA, or what we now call the USMCA, the US-Mexico-Canada Trade Agreement. That's essentially NAFTA 2.0. Here's another question about that pie chart. In Mexico's politics, which of the following would be the most controversial for a president to explain? And hopefully, I know Emmanuel out there knows the answer to this one, our master of Pemex. And this is, that would be most difficult to explain foreign direct investment in Pemex, because Pemex is a nationalized oil company. This becomes a big part of Mexico's politics as to what should the relationship of Pemex be with outside investors. Now, that was multiple choice. Let's really get into the FRQ. I'm going to give you a sample FRQ that I've written regarding today's topic related to sovereignty and economic globalization. And I'm going to go through the entire free response. So this is a free response question number 1. This is a conceptual analysis question where they're going to set you up. If you see a question number 1, they're going to set you up with a question about a core concept from comparative government. And I'm going to show you a sample question here. This is a 4-point rubric. And if we hear the announcement that College Board is going to put an FRQ number 1 on the AP exam, this is the type of question you really want to practice. I'm going to let you read through this to see how you would do. So the first task is you have a concept. This is why it's called conceptual analysis, and it's to define state sovereignty. And I'm going to walk you through each part of this to show you some of the tips, not just to understand the content here, but some of the mechanics that you can write to help you maximize your opportunity for a score. So let me take you step by step to see how you can do in these 4 rubric points. First is my potential answer for state sovereignty. State sovereignty is a government's absolute power to rule within its borders. For instance, the government of the United Kingdom has sovereignty with final legal authority over policies affecting the people in England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Okay, I've written it this way because if you remember my definition from the beginning of the lesson of sovereignty or state sovereignty that comes from the AP course description, it's a lot of this nitty-gritty of its independent legal authority over a population within a territory. But let's say you kind of forget how to put that all together. My number 1 tip, if you're ever asked to define a concept, or if you're asked to describe a concept, not only write the description or write the definition in this case, but give an example, illustrate with an example. Now, let me be really, really clear on this FRQ number 1. You do not have to give a country-specific example to get credit for any one of these 4 rubric points on FRQ number 1. That's why it's called a concept application. You don't have to have a country-specific example, but if you include an accurate country-specific example, it could be a great way of earning a point in case your definition came up a little bit short. So this is where your teachers, when they've been reading your FRQ writing, oftentimes if they ever say, be more complete, elaborate, expand on this, that's really what they're trying to get you to do, to write the definition, but then to illustrate with an example. And in this case, I took an example from the United Kingdom. You could take it from any of our core countries. You could use a hypothetical example of a hypothetical country, but try to illustrate any of your definitions, any of the core concepts with an example. And in this case, I use an example from the United Kingdom with legal authority over the 4 nations, the 4 regions of the United Kingdom to really lock down that point from letter A. Letter B asks to describe an economic policy that the government could implement that could reduce its sovereignty related to the economy. So here's where I really want to be sure that I'm repeating the vocabulary of the prompt to make sure that I'm doing what the prompt is asking me to do. So yes, it's asked me to describe an economic policy, but I want to make sure that my description of the economic policy is connected into the prompt, which is about sovereignty. So an economic policy a government could implement that could reduce its sovereignty related to its economy is allowing industries to accept foreign direct investment. Okay, be complete. Tell me about foreign direct investment. This would reduce a government's sovereignty related to its economy because investors outside the country, so here I've repeated foreign direct investment, would have a larger degree of control over economic decisions related to that industry. So we see reducing sovereignty because investors outside the country would have more power. So that's where my description is accepting foreign direct investment, and I've made sure that I'm complete in describing how that reduces sovereignty. The third point from this rubric comes from the prompt of explain one reason a government would choose to reduce its sovereignty related to its economy. Remember our rule, anytime you see the word explain, or in some cases you might see draw a conclusion when it comes to data, if you see that word explain, that directive to explain, make sure you include a word of causation, a causal word. So in this case, the easiest causal word you can use is because. A government might choose to allow foreign direct investment and reduced sovereignty related to its economy, because the government would prefer to have outsiders take risks with their financial investments on those industries, rather than the government relying on loans from international banks or increased governmental spending and debt to fund those industries. So be complete. Explain why. Make sure there's a word of causation, in this case, because. Repeat the prompt, make sure you're addressing sovereignty, and talk about the explanation. Make sure you're complete. For letter D, explain why a government's decision that could reduce its sovereignty related to the economy might cause environmental degradation. So here now they're taking multiple concepts. They're taking reduced sovereignty, they're talking about neoliberalism, and you have to connect that to environmental degradation. This is going to be the hardest point to get because you have to connect essentially 3 different concepts, and you have to use words of causation in order to explain why. So my hypothetical answer here, a government's decision to reduce its sovereignty related to its economy might affect environmental degradation because a foreign investor might be more willing to make business decisions that result in increased air and water pollution in order to maximize profits. Allowing more FDI in industries could weaken the government's control over enforcing pollution standards that could cause more environmental degradation as an indirect result of the government's reduced sovereignty related to the economy. So in many ways, this answer is kind of repetitive, but I'm repeating it to make sure that I am talking about the core concepts of this question: sovereignty, neoliberalism to reduce its sovereignty, in the cause of environmental degradation and really emphasizing words of causation. Because, could weaken. So those are my critical tips to maximize your score on a conceptual analysis question, repeating the vocabulary, making sure you have really complete definitions, and making sure you are explaining why or explaining how thoroughly as you can. So wrapping up lesson 5.3, we are talking about sovereignty today. I'm going to address sovereignty when we get into topic 1.2 in a couple more lessons. So this isn't the last time we talk about sovereignty. And that's really where a critical connection between this material from Unit 5 plays into concepts that are very much could be fair game on this revised AP comparative test in 2020. One of the examples of a country giving up sovereignty is when they accept foreign direct investment from multinational corporations. And one of the big effects of accepting that foreign direct investment could be those companies or those outside investors making decisions that are detrimental to a domestic environment, particularly as it relates to water pollution and air pollution. So just a preview of next week as we get into topics from Unit 1. You can see here in topic 1.2, and again, I'm taking these straight from the AP Comparative Government course description. Preview of 1.2 is that government is a set of institutions or individuals legally empowered to make binding decisions for a state. A government's authority is derived from the state's legitimate use of power to enforce policies and decisions. So this is all a definition of government. That's part of 1.2. The right and power to govern itself without outside interference is a crucial aspect of a state's sovereignty. A sovereign state has independent legal authority over a population in a particular territory. So that's how 5.3 relates to a concept that you might very well see from Unit 1. And then let's not forget a repeat of that concept of sovereignty in topic 1.6. How a regime chooses to use power in support of sovereignty is determined in large part by its democratic or authoritarian characteristics. Democratic regimes can maintain sovereignty using less power than authoritarian regimes. So that's where we'll see sovereignty next week. But really this week was asking to see in 5.3 if you're able to make that connection between those neoliberal policies we've been talking about in these first 3 lessons and how that can reduce a government's sovereignty. Even in authoritarian governments like China, when they allow that foreign direct investment, it can reduce a government's control over the economy. So please use some social media here. If you have questions about today's lesson or really anything about the exam prep, you can put those out on the hashtag CompGov2020. Also looking for you to pay attention to current events. Specifically, obviously, we're living through this historic event, COVID-19. We're seeing how the United States government and other governments around the world are responding not only to the healthcare catastrophe in some countries, but also economically. And that relates to sovereignty. So if you have specific examples of government's economic responses to COVID-19 beyond the United States from our core countries, it'd be great if you could tweet those out, even link a current event example so that our AP comparative community can look at your research. I'm going to leave you with a preview of our next topic, 1.1, and I'm going to have you do a little research. 1.1 is about a lot of the empirical data that political scientists use as they compare countries, and a little bit of quantitative analysis here. And one of the key stats that teachers in comparative government use and political scientists in comparative government use is called the Gini, or sometimes it's called the Gini index or the Gini coefficient. If you've never heard of Gini, this becomes a perfect way to research what this is. I'm not gonna tell you what it is. I'll tell you on our next lesson. But use that term Gini, G-I-N-I, and you can look up data from World Bank. You can look up data from the CIA fact book. You can go on Wikipedia, and there's a number of ways that Gini data is reported by country. But do me a favor, the next time we meet, try to look up what the Gini numbers are from the most recent years that you can find online. And those years can be widely varied. So look up what the Gini data is, report that data, and then I'm going to create a couple of questions based on the data that I find as we try to describe political behaviors and start looking at the concepts of the types of empirical data that comparative political scientists use. So a little bit of research homework for you before our next lesson. And again, a reminder from College Board that if you're having tech access issues, please reach out to cb.org/tech. Don't be shy about that. Be an advocate, particularly in the turmoil of how we're trying to respond to schools being shut down across the country. Be an advocate if you, or if you know others, friends or classmates who are struggling at accessing tech, help them be an advocate by reaching out. So thank you very much. I will see you again, metaphorically, on Monday, March 30th. Have a great weekend. We'll be looking at 1.1, and we'll start our review from units 1 through 3. Thank you very much. Be well.